Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. So first off, welcome everyone. We are happy that you are able to join us today. For today's presentation, we will have Charlotte Caples as our lecturer and on racial equity and the environment. The topic, the journey ahead. First, I would like to introduce our lecturer, Charlotte, with Charlotte Caples Consulting. She helps leaders develop their voice about racial equity, own their power, and hold accountable systems that impact them. She believes outcomes should not be predictable by race and that peace, power, and prosperity are everyone's birthright. Her coaching system has helped more than 5,000 leaders begin to live authentically, feel more confident, courageous, grounded, and purposeful about their journey to transform racism. As a result of her consulting compilations, organizations committed to racial equity develop transformational strategic plans to eliminate racism, minimize costs and potential for lawsuits, as well as create an organizational culture that is racially equitable and inclusive. We are very happy to have Charlotte as our second speaker of our ESW Talk series. I will be sharing a poll with you all to ask if ESW has consent to share your contact information with Ms. Charlotte. Please answer. If there are any questions, please feel free to drop it in the chat box or unmute yourselves. With this, I will like to hand it over to Charlotte for her presentation. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm so excited to be here with you. I am not a newbie to engineers. Looking for trying to set, I can't even say your name now, you know that's really bad. So now engineers for a sustainable world, because I do want you to know I do know who I'm dealing with here. I'm super excited. I would say to see you, except I can't see you. So I am going to invite every one of you to actually turn your cameras on. We are having a conversation about race and racism and the environment, and it just does not work the same when you're hiding behind your cameras. So I am is that Carly? Hi, Carly. Thank you for being so courageous and stepping up. And it doesn't matter to me what's going on in your world. It's a Saturday morning. Everybody's supposed to have some stuff. Oh, look at O and O. I so love you. Oh, Joy Deep, Dana. Y'all are marvelous. I love you. Sanjana, Mike, Molly, Omar, Maya, Caleb. There's Henry. Yes, there's real people in here, y'all. You should know that I am not a traditional presenter, and by no means do I ever consider myself to be a lecturer. I am always engaging in conversation, so this will be an engaging conversation. I do expect for you to actually unmute yourselves and talk to me. I am an interactive person. I am a woman of color, and I grew up in an environment, well, not really, because my parents used to tell me don't talk back, but they expected me to answer them or at least to make eye contact with them. So I am looking for the same thing from you. So let me just tell you, Molly, Omar, Maya, Caleb, you're going to join us. Yes, yes. Oh, yes. Omar's connecting to audio. I see you. Let me just tell y'all, I have been having conversations about race and racism since I was 2 years old. At 2, sitting in the shopping cart in the grocery store, I was called out my name by the kid in the shopping cart next to me. That was my first time ever hearing the N-word. And at 2 years old, you can only imagine, I really didn't know what that meant. But just like we know babies to be, we take in clues from our parents. So I was very clear that something was wrong with what that kid had said based on my mom's facial expressions and the way his mother reacted by gathering their stuff and moving them out of the same aisle with us. So it was that day that my parents literally sat me down at 2 years old and began to tell me how beautiful I was as a dark-skinned Black girl. They knew that they had to feed me with messages about what, to counteract the stuff that I was going to receive in the world related to racism. And, you know, I really think they told me I was cute a little too much because I kind of like believe them. So it gets in the way sometimes. I just need to let y'all know that ahead of time. But as beautiful as they told me I was and how smart I am, they also told me that the world wasn't fair. And they told me that I would always have to speak up for myself when people were mistreating me. And not only did I have to speak up for myself, but I had to speak up for the next person as well. I'm a big sister. I'm the oldest. So even though my siblings do not always appreciate me speaking up, taking up, and advocating for them, it's a part of my culture to do that. And I've never stopped. Now, as much as my parents meant for my advocacy to be, my racial advocacy to be a positive thing, you can only imagine that when I went into the workplace, that was not appreciated. So I struggled to fit in. I struggled to, I remember having a conversation with one of my coworkers, and I asked him, how did that happen racially? And actually, in all honesty, I saw an interracial couple, and I wasn't familiar with that. I'm originally from Vicksburg, Mississippi. So that's not something I see all the time. I've seen it, but not all the time. And he turned to me and he said, "You're so racist." And I was like, no, I'm usually asking to move people ahead. So are you saying I'm racist simply because I'm talking about race and racism? And the answer was yes. And so I immediately understood that I needed to approach the situation a little differently if I didn't want to be alienated. But quite honestly, I wasn't that good at it. So I got into all kinds of trouble because I couldn't stop talking about race and racism. And it's not always wanted in the workplace. I worked in juvenile justice as a therapist. And so you can only imagine with the disparities, racial disparities that we know happen in our criminal justice system, I was seeing stuff play out every day, not only with the kids, but also with the staff and employees of the organization. And again, I think I'm pretty smart. So I knew individual therapy was going to take me a long time to fix this race and racism problem. So I then shifted my focus and my study to organizational psychology. And now as an anti-racist community organizer and as a consultant, I help people minimize the cost of racism, whether it's psychosocial and or financial for organizations. Thereby, they get to avoid lawsuits. So I am going to take you all through. Now, here's the trick to what I do. I work in the community and I work within organizations. So while I'm encouraging organizations to shift the way that they do business, I'm also organizing community to hold them accountable for the way they do business. So it really would behoove organizations to kind of take my advice into consideration. But I am going to take you all through a presentation today simply because I did not want to be perceived as not being professional by not having a PowerPoint presentation for you. So I am going to share my screen with you. And I just only hope I have the right presentation up as it is at the last slide and not the beginning. So bear with me because I was scrolling through as you were coming on board. All right, today we are going to talk about racial equity in the environment and what it means for our work and our journey ahead. Today, I really want to create a consciousness about about the impact of institutional racism and the work that we actually need to do within our systems to achieve racial parity. I am going to start us off with some rules for actually engaging in conversation. And I don't know if y'all heard or not, but we're going to have an after party after this. And in that after party, we're actually, maybe I shouldn't tell you that because you won't show up, but fair game. We're going to talk about racism, and we're going to practice talking about racism because you're here to learn about it. So we might as well jump in head first, make it work. We are also going to work on becoming critical lovers of the environmental and the education system. And I'll just go ahead and tell you, while part of me wanted to only focus on the environmental system, I know that most of you are students, so you are being impacted every day by the education system. And we're going to talk about what that looks like and how it shows up in our world. And also how, even as you learn, that there's some things that we can incorporate in the way that we do business, even in our learning environment, that will move us ahead towards racial parity. How does that sound for y'all? I'm a type A achiever personality, so I know it's a whole lot, but I think we can get through the majority of it. So I'm going to tell you, feel free to unmute yourselves. And so those verbal uh-huhs, uh-uhs, and I'm looking for the wrinkles in your forehead and your facial expressions. That's the reason I wanted your cameras on. But you can talk back to me. And if there's something else you need, definitely let me know. And I will do my absolute best to take care of that and include that information with you. I'm also going to, so part of my culture is what comes up, comes out verbally or non-verbally. It's one of my many gifts and talents. You can read my face and know almost exactly what's on my mind. And if it confuses you, just ask me and I'll tell you. So, and I share that with you because my camera is up here, but y'all are down here right now. So if you find me looking down and squinting, it's because I only have one eye contact in and I'm looking down. Don't ask. It happens when you get older. I didn't believe it, but it really does happen, y'all. So fair warning, take care of your eyes on these computer screens. I promise you it makes a difference. Y'all gonna get more than you asked for today. So, how many of you, and unmute yourselves and tell me, how many of you have actually had conversations about race and racism? You can raise your hands to show me, but I kind of want to hear for you how it went as well. So let's be a little courageous and step into this conversation. So you know I'm a therapist. One of the techniques in therapy that we use is called silence, which means that I sit comfortably, quietly, and wait for you to chime in. And believe me, I can outweigh you. Joy Deep, I see you unmuted. Come on.
Yeah. So, as an Asian American, I'm been deluded to believe that racism doesn't exist, that if somebody is being rude to you for no apparent reason, it's because of something you did or said to make them behave that way. It took me some experience in life to realize that different people get treated differently in school and the workplace, depending upon who they are, but nobody wants to be upfront about it.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. And I want to acknowledge you for actually identifying your racial narrative as you begin to speak. Because when we speak, we are speaking from our perspective and how we have been impacted by race. And to hear you say, as an Asian American, gives me some context based on what I know. But you identify, and that speaks volumes, because even if we never said our race, people see us and people put us in a category, whether or not we acknowledge it or not. So thank you for modeling greatly with that.
You're welcome.
See, y'all, it was easy. Come on in the room. Mike?
Hi, Charlotte.
Hi.
So this past month, I've just gotten fed up with some of my family members' posts on Facebook. And I just started trying to have conversations with them about why I saw that what they're posting was problematic. And it went better than it has in the past, but still not great.
Mm-hmm. So what made it not great and what made it better?
Well, partially, I couldn't tell if my family was being sarcastic in their responses or just like not trying to really acknowledge what I was saying. What made it better? What made it better maybe is that I was better equipped to respond to what they were saying, I guess.
Okay. Awesome. Great. And so you have seen a change in even the way you've been able to engage.
Yeah, I would say so.
Okay. That's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Anybody else? I see you, Carly. So is it fair to say that at least all of us? Come on in. You're a little breaky, but I can hear you. Repeat yourself. All right, when you're ready, let me know. So is it fair to say that everybody has had a conversation about race or racism at some point in time, by show of hands? Okay, head nod. All right, for those of you I can see, for the most part, most of the times what was just described, particularly what Mike just described, is what happens. Sometimes we don't feel equipped. Sometimes we're afraid to have those conversations. Most of the times we're definitely uncomfortable. So I want to offer to you what I call rules of engagement. So before you have a conversation about race or racism, that you set up some precedents about how you're going to do it. And I'm going to do it with us here. And hopefully we can carry these with us as we continue to have the conversation. Because sometimes when we talk about race and racism, it feels like, I know y'all wondering what is with that picture over there. Have you ever felt like you have just been kicked in your gut when you mean well, but something just knocks the life out of you? And sometimes you find yourself off your feet, unsure of even how you're going to land. And if you're anything like me, maybe you've been the person kicking occasionally. Hopefully not, but it happens. But we're going to put some ground rules in place. And so very easily, the idea that we should listen to each other, and not the kind of listening we have learned to do while we're on our cell phones and not that kind, but truly engaging with the person. And oftentimes we say with respect, but what's really important is that we identify what respect means for the next person, because it changes. I know when I'm talking to you, I am not expecting any one of you all to curse at me, nor are you expecting me to do such thing. But if I'm at home with my cousins and we're just sitting around the backyard, words are gonna rip the whole time. And sometimes I'm like, oh, I gotta remember I'm at home. It's my family. So respect means something different for me in different situations. And so we've got to analyze that for ourselves as well as with the person we're talking to. But one of the main things that we have to do is speak our truth. if we come to the table and are not willing to show up as our full selves, then we give other people permission not to acknowledge and honor our humanity as well. And it doesn't mean that people won't have a different opinion about what you're speaking, because we all have different truths based on our own experiences. But being able to speak your truth in a liberated zone, in a liberated space where people are going to at least listen and receive what you are saying, sets the pace for having a fruitful, genuine conversation. And I dare say effective. And you should know that even at this very moment, as many times as I have talked about racism, I am uncomfortable. I know when that bead of sweat forms on the back of my neck and runs down the center of my back. It is something that I have learned to expect to happen. And you too should know that talking about race and racism is supposed to be uncomfortable. We've been trained not to talk about racism. I think Joy Deep said that. Did you, am I putting words in your mouth, or did you say that you didn't always or wasn't supposed to talk about racism?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, it's our reality. It's a part of our culture that it is impolite, politically incorrect to bring up the conversation of race. But we have to, because it's in the room whether or not we want it there or not. So discomfort is okay. And you can eventually get comfortable being uncomfortable. We say that uncomfortable space is your growing edge. It's that space where there's a possibility for you to learn something different, to experience something different, and to move forward in your understanding and or perception of other people. And so even today, if you hear things that you feel that bead of sweat on your neck, I'm going to ask you to lean in. You can lean in literally, or just lean in to focus more, because it is a struggle. But the key to talking about race and racism and struggling is to do it together. The fact that we go, and now we're physically distancing from each other, but to actually try to handle that situation away from others and disconnect it creates isolation. And I dare say the stages of grief will happen for sure. And people tend to find themselves either still stuck in denial and or stuck in depression. And we don't want you there. Oh, and I'm going to add anger. We don't want you there. So let's struggle together about racism and stay engaged mentally, physically, staying in the room. Have you ever had somebody storm out the room on you when you were in the middle of a sentence because they didn't like what you were saying? Am I the only one? Yeah, okay, yeah. I see a couple of hands. Yeah, my sister loves slamming doors, and she will leave me in a moment. And my biggest challenge with her is, babe, stay in the room with me. Stay connected to me. You're still gonna be my sister at the end of this conversation. Let's work through it. And let's stay focused on the topic at hand. If we are talking about race and racism, let's stay focused there and not begin to talk about sexism or ableism or the many other isms that they are. And there are. Not to say that they're not important, but know that it's always a race and conversation. And when you try to change the topic, it's a way of escaping rather than staying engaged. Conversations only work when everybody participates and everybody engages. If not, this is just a monologue. It's not a conversation. So if you ever find yourself just being the one talking, then step back and allow space for someone else to step in and share their truth with you. You should know that we are not going to agree on everything. Imagine that. So you can go into a conversation expecting that we're not going to agree. And when it shows up, accept that we're not going to agree. It doesn't mean that things don't shift for people at a different time. And I know most of the time when I'm talking to a room of people who have been mandated or voluntold to be in the room and talk about race and racism, they don't want to hear a word that I'm saying. But I know that I'm planting seeds. I'm planting seeds, and you would not believe how many times people, it's a little scary sometimes, but people, they remember me because I'm facilitating, but I may not remember everybody in the room. And they walk up to me in the grocery store and wherever, and they get this close to my face. And they were like, you made me mad talking about racism. And I've learned to fix my face and say, and listen intensely. But what they inevitably always say is, but I thought about it. And, you know, this piece of that conversation, I resisted you then, but I get it now. And so while I expected and accepted non-closure in the moment, I planted a seed and had the opportunity for people to come back and tell me just how they have shifted as they continue to marinate in the conversation. Know that there's no quick fix. Racism didn't start yesterday. We are not going to have the answer for it today. And one of the things that can be very challenging with engaging in fruitful, productive relationships is getting rid of the hierarchy. If you're having a conversation with a supervisor and or a parent, God forbid, I've had enough. Y'all don't want to know. Who knew that a child could have such different thinking about racial equity than a parent, especially a Black child? And they started me on this journey. Yes, my dad's favorite thing to say to me is, I'm still the dad. So he invokes the hierarchy in our conversations all the time. So by show of hands, if you think that these are things that you can agree to practice with me during this presentation and or in the future as you continue to have conversations, let me see by show of hands. Okay, for all of those who are willing to show their faces. I see your hands, Molly. Thank you. So thank you. We are going to now, so since I set up the rules, it's time to actually invoke the rules and we're going to use the rules, right? Okay, as long as you know. So now I have a question for you all, and I do expect an answer from everyone. How might racism show up in the environmental system and or the education system? You can unmute yourselves and talk to me. I will welcome conversation in the chat, although part of talking about racism is actually talking. You strengthen your voice, the power of your voice. The more you say, the more you get used to saying. So how might racism show up in the environmental and or education system? You know, if you type something in chat, I'm gonna ask you to read it, right? It's just gonna be a setup. I just need you to know that.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, I've had some sound quality issues, so things will lag. But I would say, like, in terms of environmental racism, like a lot of communities that are, I guess you would say, are more in the minority group are, I feel like, a lot more are harder hit by environmental, like, systematic decisions, in a sense. You can look at like native tribes, you can look at developing countries, especially in regards to like climate change.
Thank you for that. Other ways. listening.
So, hi everyone. For the education system, at least feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. So, what I heard is in many school districts, specific school districts are kind of like set up where they're mainly like low socioeconomic status, school districts with particular people of color, and then other school districts who are primarily Caucasian or white have better funding in regards to either facilities or teachers get paid more. And so education being one of the primary factors to really uplift people from lower class to either middle class or upper class has really been kind of leaning towards wealthier school districts with primarily Caucasian people rather than people of color.
Yes, thank you for that, Owen. Powerful. There's so much in the process of districting and how we set up the zones for our school systems. And that impacts the funding, which then brings in the financial system in addition to the education system. You even talked about segregation and how just being separate and the impact of receiving different funding can be. Great, thank you. Other ways that racism can show up in the environmental and the education system.
I would like to expand on the Owen's point that in the late 90s when the Columbine shooting happened, that's when there suddenly became a nationwide problem in school shootings and violence. But what was just a chance occurrence in a predominantly white affluent school district is just regular occurrence in inner city, predominantly minority school districts.
Yes, thank you for that. And even so, there being a focus on the school shootings in white neighborhoods and white communities, whereas we also have violence and gun violence in poorer communities and specifically communities of color, in the way that we handle those. You know, I have yet, even in the school district, one of the first school shootings was in Mississippi, in Pearl, Mississippi. And I can't tell you that there are metal detectors in those areas in schools, but I can go into other schools where there are clearly metal detectors and a guard up front. So even the way we began to police those schools after incidents like school shootings. So yes, thank you. Sanjana, you know you're gonna talk to me today, right?
Yeah, of course. Wanted to make sure that we made space for all of the participants, all of the students to speak up, but definitely as, you know, people who are working on leading environmental organizations, as people who are working on, you know, supporting environmental organizations and the work that we're trying to push forward, you know, the environmental movement definitely has like a very ingrained history of racism, you know, and it kind of started out as trying to keep wildlands pristine and saying that Native people who are actually stewards of the land and were actually contributing to its health weren't really allowed to go there because, oh, you know, we don't know how to take care of it, so no one does, and stuff like that. You know, and you see it continuing to this day in various aspects. You know, you see effects of historical segregation carrying through in health effects today, you know, from environmental regulations and public health concerns. You know, you see environmental injustices occurring. You see sort of the concept of sacrificial nations or communities is something that I'd really recommend everyone look into. You know, this idea that some people's lives and livelihoods are inherently less valuable for, you know, no real reason, but unfortunately due to possibly racist tendencies, you know, so we definitely have, even though I think, you know, folks in the environmental space want to do good and want to say that we're trying to protect our planet, you know, it doesn't really matter if we're not actually trying to protect all of the people who are on this planet. So acknowledging kind of the painful history that this space has and just being aware of these biases in, you know, technology, programs, existing stuff that we're continuing or new programs that we're starting, hugely, hugely important. And so I think that it's very, very important for us, being in the environmental technical space, to be very aware of kind of the types of technologies we create and how they're actually helping people rather than harming them. So lots to think about there.
Yes, yes, and you said a lot. And one of the things that we don't do is engage with the people of a land, who's whatever community, even if it's from urban to suburban, and I hate that terminology because it's racist in itself. But the idea that coming into a community to serve, we often don't engage with the people who are there. We just tell them what we think they need to fix whatever we think the problem is. So absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Anybody else want to contribute? All right. Well, you all have talked about several different things. Okay. I'm not going forward. Okay. So, but one of those things that I want to make sure that we're clear about are the different forms of racism. And I like to talk about 3 forms of racism. And the first is individual racism or interpersonal racism. And we usually think about this. This is usually the common definition that most people use. And that is the idea that we're thinking about those individual, mean-spirited, ugly acts that people do to each other or to a different people. But it's very much a person-to-person interaction. And even sometimes when we think about, like, in the education system, I actually think about the times that professors have said to me that I shouldn't go into a field because they didn't think it was the right field for me. And so that person saying that I'm not cut or fit for a system or career is in a form of individual racism. And it may be, I'm going to use the terminology intentional or unintentional, whereas sometimes we commonly say conscious or unconscious. I buy into the belief that when we begin to talk about unconscious bias or implicit bias, is that we are giving permission or making an escape for white people to actually acknowledge what their gut tells them. People understand how people of color are treated, but because we're not intentional in focusing on that, then we tend to say it was unconscious. We weren't really thinking about it. Well, we weren't trying to think about it either. And there's been some research around how implicit bias is not really serving us well in the racial equity world. But even when you think about individual racism, if we took all of those mean-spirited, ugly, biased, bigoted people, and I don't even want to put them on the moon because I like the moon, but somewhere, would we still have racism in this world? I see head nods. You can unmute and talk to me. We would still have racism in this world. Come on. You will not offend me if you talk while I'm talking. Yeah. So speak up.
Yeah, racism exists not just in America, but everywhere. And it's just something inevitable. I was once at an art museum. I was speaking to a Nigerian guy who was part of the tour, and there was this rare painting of an old Nigerian kingdom and then the kingdom of Portugal with a diplomatic meeting. And he just told me that when the first two made contact with each other, they conducted diplomacy as equals. They had ambassadors in each other's territory, but as the Portuguese realized that they were technologically more advanced and had the power to enforce more concessions, that's just how colonialism and racism emerged. It's just the experience of one group dominating the other.
In some instances, I would agree with you. That dominance that you're talking about has always happened in the world. You know, as far as we can go back, we can say not that there was race, but there has been dominance, there has been slavery, there has been this whole idea of war and capture. It's a part of just how we've interacted with each other. But specifically, race was created to justify what was happening in the colonization as we formed the United States. So it's a very specific, intentional kind of act that is different from just the world dominance, or I'm a dominant culture or dominant people. And that there was a plan about it. I think that's the thing that probably bugs me the most about race and racism, is that somebody literally sat down, and not somebody, but a bunch of somebodies literally sat down and devised this plan. And even as that didn't work in some instances, they would readjust and replan. It was very strategically and intentionally done, and things were put into place. And what we end up seeing is actually another form of racism, which is institutional racism. That even as we began to form our organizations and our systems, that this mindset or this intentionality was built into the structure of our systems. And even to this day, if we got rid of all of the individual mean acts, we would still have institutional racism, because it's embedded in our policies, in our procedures, in our practices and attitudes within our organizations. And do any of you have an example of how even individual racism or institutional racism would show up, whether it's in environmental and education or any other situation that you can think of? Yes, ma'am.
So I guess it's not, I don't feel like it directly applies to me, but like, I mean, I remember talking about it with some of my friends in high school when we were doing like our standardized tests. And I mean, I was adopted and I'm an Asian American, but like my name does not, like you don't read my name and think, oh, she's Asian. But one of my friends, like, lucky that you don't have that, you know, racism held to your name. Like you're not expected to have a higher score this way or that way. Like when a college looks at your application, they're not gonna be like, oh, they're Asian, their score should be higher, whether or not that person is conscious of it or not. And I just remember like that thought kind of like blew my mind a little bit, just in a sense that it wasn't really something I thought about before. So.
Yeah, the name, and that actually falls into another form of racism, but it is, my name is Charlotte. That's not a typical Black girl name. It affords me some stuff because people don't know my race simply by looking at my name. But Carly is the same way. You don't know, you definitely don't hear Asian in Carly. And the fact, so, and I am not one of the people who, I'm okay with people looking at names to determine the race of a person, not for why you might think, but because to me, if they are using it to diversify and potentially bring in people where they know that they are short or weak, then I'm okay with that. And actually, when I moved to Texas to work in the juvenile justice system, I walked into my panel interview and there was an audible sigh. And I was like, what's that about? Focus, you got to get this job. But I heard it and it registered. It wasn't until they walked me around the organization, and specifically they took me to meet people from Mississippi because they knew I was moving from Mississippi. And one of those people said to me, you are Black. And I was like, all day, every day, why would you say something like that? And he said, oh, because we passed around your resume just to figure out if you were going to be Black or not, because we got a white therapist, we have a Latina therapist, we needed a Black one. They didn't even consider hiring an Asian therapist, but they were trying to diversify. And okay, I learned I was a diversity hire at that very moment. And I don't know that it bothered me at that time because I was glad to have a job. But what did begin to bother me falls into institutional racism, in that they wanted my Black face, but they didn't want my Black opinion, mindset, perspective. And so I went through all kinds of things to silence my voice, to silence my critical thinking. And self-doubt would creep in. And literally depression creeped in because I was being pushed down so much. And institutions, whether or not they intend to, whether or not they know they're doing it, we can have race neutral policies, but still have disproportionality and disparities based on race, because policies and procedures may favor some unknowingly. And that's how institutional racism stays, even when we get rid of the mean-spirited people. And we like to focus on those people. Just look at Facebook. They talking about people all day long. I'm not worried about the people. It's this institutional racism that's causing Black women to die sooner, not have babies, not get the health care they need, to not get the education, same level of education as others, that is expecting Asian Americans to perform better or to go into fields that they might not be interested in at all because you are the model, and I'm gonna use the M word, minority. That's just as bad as the N word to me. Because if you think about the root word of minority, what is it?
Minor in Latin, which means small.
Mm-hmm. And we commonly think about it as meaning less than. So now you're the model less than person. That doesn't sound like something positive. And most people will say that it's a numbers thing. When the M word is used, we're talking about you're less in number or smaller in number. Well, then if that's the case, why do we have the majority minority conversation? Come on, Joy Deep, I saw you unmute.
Well, in just about every country where there's a dominant racial, ethnic, religious group versus another, it always pops up. I mean, like Christians in Arab countries, Muslims in India are members of like smaller language groups. Even in African countries, there are linguistic communities that are so small, almost going extinct. And there have been civil wars that have been fought along those lines.
Absolutely. So yes, there is the idea of oppression based on all of these other isms. It happens in many forms, and it may happen differently depending on what country you're in. So we have to be intentional in talking about the setting we're talking about too, which is why I specifically said the environmental and the education setting, so that we can begin to set the parameters for how we're going to define and identify racism in those settings, therefore allowing us space to be able to move forward. And it shows up everywhere. And that even speaks to what we call cultural racism. the fact that we just have a way of being with each other that embodies racism, embodies the hierarchy of race with white on the top, black on the bottom, and everybody else get in where you fit in, depending on how the powers of be need you. Because there was a point in time in the United States when Chinese could be what do you call it when you naturalized as a United States citizen. Do any of you know what was happening in this world or in this country when that was okay?
Well, which decade are you referring to when that?
You can pick one.
Okay, because, well, the Asian Exclusion Act wasn't repealed until 1965, but before it was passed in the early 20th century, yeah, there were instances of Chinese migrant workers coming in, but they were barred from bringing in family members like wives.
Yes.
And then they're barred from marrying within the local women.
Yes.
So it was just a government ploy to just kill off their numbers.
Right. Absolutely right. Thank you. And that's what I mean when I say that when it's beneficial, will appear to give you something, but not really, because you can't really establish wealth, family, land, even though we say you can be a citizen. And then we decide, oh, we don't want to do that no more, and we repeal. We take it back. It happened in Mexican culture. And in fact, it's happening right now in Mexican culture because we're talking about borders. Well, technically, if we're going to honor the humanity, whose land was it? Yeah. And when Texas acquired 11 states, it was all Mexican land, or I'm going to say indigenous land, because it may not have all been Mexican in heritage. But now people are not welcome. Literally, people went to sleep in Mexico and woke up in the United States when the bill was passed. And now we're saying that you're not welcome here. It's too many. You're going to outnumber us. So we've got to find a way. And that's just become a way of being. It repeats itself in our history. And even in cultural racism, we have the environmental racism, linguistic racism, militarism, and all of those. Linguistic racism is the M word. You know, we say it all the time. We say it about ourselves sometimes. But ultimately, if you are saying something, and I believe in self-fulfilling prophecy, if you call me less than long enough, won't I begin to act less than? And like so, if you call me the model less than long enough, I'm going to go through some extremes to maintain that or live up to that, or should I say live down to that. And so we've got work to do in all forms of racism, institutional being something that we can literally put our fingers on. If we begin to run our data by race and ethnicity, we can truly see the disparities in treatment that's happening in communities and schools and an environment. And we've got to understand, too, how we use the police and the military to quiet a people when they're speaking their truth. Or even in the school setting, how we're criminalizing adolescent behavior by bringing the police into our school settings. And that's just becoming part of our culture. Does anyone else have anything they want to add about the different forms of racism? Racism is a money business. Who knew that companies were paying $82 million in lawsuits. Who knew that I'm like, oh, let me rethink some of the situations I've been in. $250,000 average, how much companies pay out. And if people literally get together in a class action lawsuit, average of $56 million have been paid out simply because people, companies, organizations are not setting their systems, their organization up in a way that is equitable, racially equitable. How many of you are with an organization that can afford to pay $250,000 for every lawsuit that comes against them and still stay in business? Not many can say that. And I am going to say that all of these lawsuits, or most of them, were because people didn't mean to do something. They were well-meaning in the way they set things up. Good people. Because if they did the other stuff, it would be illegal. Intentionally violating someone's rights or discriminating based on racism is illegal. These lawsuits are mostly because they got caught in something that they didn't even know was going on. And 5 to 25% of business income is spent dealing with racism. So while most of you are in school thinking about what you're going to do after school, how then, and if some of you are going to start your own business or your own company as engineers or whatever field you want to be in, how conscious of you in budgeting 5 to 25% of your income to handle racism after, because you didn't do anything to address it before. And not only is there just a monetary cost to racism, but there's a silent cost to racism. Tell me what you think. And I said type in the comments, but you can unmute yourself and tell me, what do you think is meant by silent racism, or the impact of silent racism within organizations, even within you? How does it impact you?
I think of silent racism as kind of someone, I guess, like not realizing that what they're saying is racist. I mean, I've seen like posts on Facebook of things that people think are racist, and like they're just common things that people say in a conversation. You don't really stop and think, oh wait, maybe that has a racist history, or wait, maybe I'm being offensive to somebody, just because you're so used to saying it. And you've never come across anybody that's been like, hey, what you just said is like racist. Are you offended me, or something along those lines?
Mm-hmm. And two things may happen. Thank you for that. Two things may happen. One from the person who does it, and another from the person who receives it. So if in that same scenario, if someone says, hey, you may not know it, but you just offended me, what do you think the person who said the thing feels or does from then on?
Are you asking me specifically?
You can answer, but I'm asking everybody. They know I'm talking to them, Carly.
Your question is about the person who I guess basically got notified or told that what they said was offensive.
Mm-hmm. How do they begin to behave?
I would hope that they would start to kind of be a little more conscious of their own behavior and their speech and their choice of words. But I know that's not always realistic. I think some people are just like, whatever. I mean, I think a lot of it is also in the context of how you say it and who is saying it to you. Depending on the person, sometimes like just some random stranger telling you that, you're like, whatever, I don't care what you think. I don't know you. I'm never going to see you again. And, but if like, or if it's someone like you're really close with, like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize I was doing that. Like, thank you for telling me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And even if they say, thank you for telling me in this instance, they begin to second guess everything they're going to say to you from that point on, because they don't ever want to be caught in that situation ever again. And most of the time we find that white people experience that there becomes this fear, there becomes a sense of self-doubt in who they are, and what they know about racism. And it may be true that they are not as aware, but at the same time, there's a responsibility to become aware. And even if we were the receiving person, how do we begin to behave?
Like for me, if someone said that to me, I would really be like very conscious about what I said, and I'd be like, okay, I'd probably ask like, okay, what about what I said was offensive to you? And I would try to be really conscious about making sure that I don't say anything along those lines again. I think generally I try to be very conscious of how I'm speaking to people, and I have a tendency to like apologize and say like, hey, I don't mean this to be offensive in any way or form. Like, that's just what I'm saying. And if I am offending you, like, let me know, or like, you know, that kind of thing.
May I use you for a moment?
Yeah, go ahead.
So as you're guessing or thinking, oh, I don't mean to do that, and oh, I don't want to do that again, do you think there are potentially some times that you know the answer, or you do know some stuff, but you hold back because just in case?
I think sometimes it's more of along the lines of like, it's not my intention for it to be offensive, but like you can't control how people are going to react to what you say. You can only control like how you go moving forward, and you can apologize for what you said. I mean, I guess not to use the word minority, but I think being a member of the minority makes me a little more conscious of what other minorities kind of deal with, in the sense that you kind of have that camaraderie, like, hey, we're all in the minority, like we're all.
Oh, Carly, you're cussing at me. You're cussing at me. I can't take it. I can't take it. So I'm going to offer a word, and you can choose to use it or not to use it. And because there's plenty of discussion about whether or not it's relevant or the word that we should be using anyway, but people of color, whoever it is you mean to be talking about, say that. If you mean Black people, say Black people. If you mean Asian people, say Asian people. If you mean the collective, say people of color. And I don't have to guess. Who's she talking about? Mm-hmm. So thank you for letting me offer that. Ooh, my ears be burning because, you know, I'm a Black woman. I get messages all day long. I just can't take it. I'm sorry. I got virgin ears. Thank you.
Definitely will try to use that more often. I think part of it's just like a habit, because like that's just how it's always talked about.
It is.
Like whether you unconsciously do it or not, it's just like it's the way it's talked about. So that's kind of like the language or the jargon that you use to talk about it. That's how everybody talks about it.
Right. You're absolutely right. But that's the stuff we have to disrupt. That's the stuff that we have to say, you know what, that's not right. We're not doing that anymore. And I even think about like, and it shows up in so many different ways. I got a virus on my computer at work one day, and the IT guy came by to fix it. And he was like, oh, well, then we just need to put that one on the black list and this one on the white list. And I was like, did you just hear yourself? We are not doing that. Can you take all of that software off of my computer, please? And he was like, we can't do that. But yeah, I caught it too. Sorry. You know, it's not gonna really do it in that instance, but as people began to program, they can recognize the linguistic racism that shows up in our computer software and begin to change. And we do it in the environmental world. We do it in the education world. We do it in criminal justice. We do it in healthcare, in the financial world. Financial world, if we have another Black Friday sale, I'm gonna scream. It's Black Friday because that was the day you were in the black, and you're in the black historically because you had a large number of Black people in chattel slavery, enslaved, and we still use the language not knowing where it came from all the time. And I do it too, but as I learn better, I do better. Yes, sir.
Oh, me. Yeah. I was recalling actually in a prior job of mine. So I was just in a meeting to submit a building design review of construction and specifications. So the specifications were written by an architect who's a Russian immigrant, doesn't speak that good English, so there are a lot of spelling typos and everything. And the guy reviewing my work keeps pointing out spelling errors here and there, not checking the content of the specs, but just all these nitpicking things. And that's the thing. Like, once somebody is like nitpicking those things, you know what they're really after. They're saying you can't speak English, you don't belong here. And I told him repeatedly, I did not write those specs. The other guy did. And, you know, for God's sake, his work computer was programmed in Cyrillic. And that's just an illustration. Like, the white guy barely speaks any English. You know, he's not the one who sailed over it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a tough one to, you know, and as a person of color, what can you do? How do you change that at the moment? You can call it in to say, you know, hey, and what I have learned to do is to say, this isn't my work. And it seems as if you are projecting some of your beliefs or biases on the work based on me presenting it to you. I probably wouldn't say it that a roundabout. I would probably say it more directly because that's just who I am. But I literally I have white colleagues at this point where they get tickled because they know it's coming at some point when they mess up. They even tell me, okay, you could tell me if that was too white. And I'd be like, I will. Because when you present that way for me, and I'm like, is that whiteness showing up, or is that truly a problem with this right now? So it's hard to, and that's why, you know, the juvenile justice system didn't really like me, because I used to ask those kind of questions in the workplace. But it's the only way we're going to do something different. And I'm proud to say that the juvenile justice system wants the work now, whereas they didn't want it 20 years ago. So, you know, it took a while, but people adjust. So we've got to learn, and we've got to call people in. I say call people in, because it's not about shaming and blaming. It's not about, well, sometimes you want them to feel bad because you feel bad, but you know, hurt people. So it's really not about shaming and blaming people, but about calling people into a journey where we're going to have racial equity. And part of that is in the language that we use, and identifying our biases and how we discriminate against people. Thank you both for sharing. I recognize, Alyssa, at the time, how are we? I want to respect people's time, and we started at 11, and it's almost 10 after. So did we tell y'all that we're gonna have an after party to allow us to continue the conversation, ask whatever questions we want to ask? So I'm going to yield to Sanjana and Alisa to see if you want to continue with this, and let me wrap up quickly, or if you want to transition to respect people's time.
I was thinking that we can go ahead and wrap up, and then I'll go ahead and close off the recording, and then we can go ahead and proceed to the after party.
Awesome. That sounds good to everybody else? All right. All right. So these are just some of the things that I saw that I know have showed up within workplaces when it comes to the silent cost. People don't produce their best. And even in education, if you're in school and you feel in some kind of way because somebody's treating you some kind of way, you don't produce as well as you could if you were in an ideal environment. And that costs the company, but it also costs us, the individual, as well. It costs the company because we don't stay in companies where we don't feel comfortable, valued. Companies have poor reputation and negative outcomes, and we genuinely began to just distrust people altogether. And so, just to be clear, when we say racial equity, we're talking about outcomes that can't be predicted by race. And right now, there is not a system, there is not an organization. If you don't believe me, run the numbers in your organization and then call me and tell me what you find. but every organization has racial disparities simply because systems and organizations were built to serve white people. They were built by white people for white people. At some point in time, we fought, bled, died, protested to be a part of organizations, but they didn't change the way that they do business to match our way of life. They continue with business as usual. And so a lot of times we like to say systems or institutions are broken. They're not. They're doing exactly what they were designed to do. White people are faring better than people of color. And our goal is to have it so that you can't tell simply by someone's race how well they're going to do in a system. And so I am going to leave you with that. Yes, I'm going to leave you with that, but I will tell you that there is opportunity for us to continue this conversation beyond the happy hour, and that is working or partnering with me using my 6-point plan to undo institutional racism. And so these are the steps that I break down in serving organizations who really want to transform and be anti-racist and multicultural in every aspect of their being. And Meredith is an executive who actually, I would put her in the environmental system because she actually worked with an agency that went into communities prior to assess and connect with the community before the gentrification started from her larger organization. So there's opportunity for us to work together. And I'm going to tell you, I have a collaboration with Alexander Williams, who has produced his own rainwater. It's called Aura. I'm sharing, he didn't know I was going to share, but this was my water here. But he is also partnering with me to begin an intern program where we will bring in people to approach the environmental system from an anti-racist analysis. So there's future opportunities for that as well. And just a little food for thought as I close out, race relations remain a critical factor in the quality of community life. What's been missing has not been the will of many well-intentioned groups and people. What's been missing has been leadership in business and government. I'm going to add education and environment. We've been too timid to put the R word, racism, on our agenda for social change. I think the time has come, and we are all really focused on creating racial equity. So I appreciate you sharing your time with me. If you want to engage, you can, my website, charlottecaples.com. We can continue this conversation on a whole nother individual level, but we're gonna continue in the after party.
Okay, thank you, Charlotte. So on behalf of ESW and EarthX, we would like to thank Charlotte for her wonderful interactive presentation, and we look forward to sharing this recording to everyone on our websites and via email. Again, I wanted to invite everyone to participate in our after party to have a direct conversation with Charlotte and others. Thank you.